The answer is that those of us in the United States and in the world who don't accept this idea must declare very forcibly and act very vigorously against this idea and insist that the ethical norms that most decent people can agree on should be observed, and that no country should be an exception to the rules of morality in world affairs, and that the children of the world should all be seen as part of a family, and that the children of Iraq or the children of China or the children of anywhere in the world have the same right to life as American children. I mean, those are very fundamental moral principles which if our government doesn't uphold them, we must uphold them. Fortunately, there are people all over the world who want to uphold those principles and who oppose it when the United States does not. And we saw, on February 15th, 2003, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, we saw that amazing moment when, on one day, 10 to 15 million people around the world, in 60, 70 countries around the world, demonstrated against that war. And so there are people all over the world who do not accept the idea of American exceptionalism. When last week the State Department issued its report on human rights abuses, some of you may have seen that in the newspapers, the State Department issued its report on it does this every year. It lists countries which are guilty of torture and other abuses of human rights. And so it lists a bunch of countries. A number of those countries are countries which are allies of the United States. A number of those are countries to which the United States has sent prisoners. And I think by now you know that this notion of extraordinary rendition, where we're not going to torture these people, we'll send them to countries which will torture them. And so the State Department issues this list of countries which have violated human rights. And then when the report came out, there were responses from around the world which said, hey, there's one country which is missing from this list. And yes, what about the United States? And what about, a Turkish newspaper said there's not even a mention of the incidents in Abu Ghraib prison, no mention of Guantanamo. A newspaper in Sydney, Australia, pointed out that the United States sends suspects. Remember, suspects are not people who've been tried and found guilty of anything, just people who are suspected of doing something. Sends suspects to prisons in Morocco, Egypt, Libya, Uzbekistan, countries that the State Department says uses torture. And so people around the world, yes, and here in the United States. And this is something that we very often are deprived of. We're not only deprived of history, we're very often deprived of immediate history, because we're deprived of things that happen in this country that people are doing that we don't know about, because this is a big country. But that would be an easy excuse, that we're a big country and that's why we don't know about them. No, we don't know about these things that are happening around the country, these protests, these declarations of humanity. We don't know about them because they're not really reported. And so if you go to the internet, you might find out. If you go to a rally, you might get some of this information. If you travel around the country, you might learn that, this coming weekend there will be demonstrations in cities all over the country. There's going to be a demonstration in New Orleans. There's going to be a demonstration in Fayetteville, North Carolina. There's a resistance movement in the United States to this war. And you see only the superficial, you might say, recognition of this when you read public opinion polls, which show that now about half the country does not believe in the war. And if half the country does not believe in the war, then somewhere among that 50%, there must be many, many people who are actively opposing that war. And those people are in fact engaged in protest all over the United States. And what's perhaps most significant is that in the armed forces and in the families of the armed forces, there is more and more defection from this war. The Iraqi veterans against the war formed in kind of reprise of what we had during Vietnam veterans against the war. And we have military families speak out of the families of soldiers organizing and who now have thousands of members. And GIs themselves, GIs in the field, and you read about instances of mutiny, and GIs who say we don't want to, who've been to Iraq, who are being sent back, who don't want to go back, and some of them go to Canada, and some of them get court-martialed. And this is important because I think of what Einstein said when, at the end of after World War I, horrified by that war and by the idea of war itself and by the knowledge that now modern warfare would be indiscriminate and massive. And Einstein said, wars will stop when men refuse to fight. And so the refusal to fight and refusal of families to let their kids fight and the insistence of the parents of high school kids that they will not let recruiters come into the high schools and approach their kids, all of these things are consistent with what Einstein thought was ultimately the way that wars would stop. So I leave you with the idea that we're not alone, and that there are people all over the world and people in this country who do not accept the idea of a special dispensation to do whatever we want in the world, and who will insist on human equality of people everywhere. And I think of William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist. I think of what was on the masthead of his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. On his masthead were the words, "My country is the world, my countrymen are mankind." A good thing to remember. Thank you. Okay.
We have around 15 minutes for questions. Anybody would like to speak?
All right. Hi, Professor.
Oh,
My question was, do the people in our government, do they believe their own rhetoric? Because I feel it must take an extreme suspension of belief to, believe a lot of this rhetoric of democracy and, American freedom being spread everywhere. And, or do they act knowingly? And if they act blindly, is it because of the structure of our educational systems and our government? Or do they simply act with knowledge and disbelief of the rhetoric?
this will be just between us.
they blinded by the educational system of government, or is it conscious or?
Please use the microphones for the videotape.
Did you all hear the question? Okay. Do the people in government who do what they do they believe in what they do, or are they brainwashed by themselves? Or that is, yeah, but essentially, that's a tough question. And I don't think I have an answer to this. I don't know if anybody has an answer to this, because I think the answer varies from person to person. I think there are people who understand what they're doing and don't care. You know, they know what they want and they're going to get it, and they don't care and they're willing to lie, but the lies are acceptable because it's going to achieve the results that they want. These people are cynical people. They know what they're doing. And there are other people, I think, who persuade themselves. I mean, the human mind has an infinite capacity for self-deception, and therefore there are people. I'm sure there are people in government who really believe in what they're doing, who actually believe that they're advancing the cause of liberty and democracy in the world by what they're doing. But as I say, I don't think there's any one answer for this great conglomeration of decision makers.
I wanted to ask which kind of. My name is Tomer Gotthelf. I'm one of the Humphrey Fellows. I'm from Israel. And I wanted to ask which kind of institutions in American society do you think needs to implement these moral norms? Because I was looking at the United States policy in the last 2 years, at the detainees at Guantanamo and about the judiciary. And I was seeing that the judiciary was more interested in gay marriage than in detainees' rights. And I was asking myself which kind of institutes will handle these kind of moral issues that you're speaking about.
Oh, you say what kind of
institution?
I think we've, especially in countries that have institutions that seem democratic and that, you know, on the surface will guarantee our liberties. I think that is a country like the United States. We tend to overvalue institutions, and very often we think that if a situation is bad, we can correct it by setting up another institution or by amending the Constitution. I can't tell you how many times people have approached me and said, I have the following amendments to the Constitution. And don't you think that if we adopted these amendments that everything? No. Institutions are all malleable, subject to interpretation. Well, we can see that with the Constitution. We can see that with even the Supreme Court, which claims to be a strict interpreter of whatever the Constitution says. No, all these institutions depend on who has the power, and laws are violated with impunity by the government. It doesn't matter what laws you pass. Now, you can pass a law limiting the powers of the FBI. It won't matter, because the FBI doesn't have to obey the law. Because if the FBI violates the law, who will go after it? The FBI? I mean, we have a long history of government violation of law. And so the answer doesn't lie in institutions or even in laws. Now, it helps to have some laws rather than other laws, but those aren't critical. I mean, we changed the Constitution at the end of the Civil War to give black people, freedom from slavery, presumably equal rights with the 14th Amendment, the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, and so there we had institutionalized racial equality. It didn't matter.